hear me. Everybody over there.
With your all right, everyone. Hello. It's nearly 7 o'clock, I think. And with that, let me first thank you and welcome you all to tonight's talk. I appreciate you all taking the time to be here, to tune in through Facebook Live in what has already been an eventful week, and which of course promises to continue that trend moving forward. So, my name is Dr. Devlin Scofield. I'm an assistant professor of history in the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences. And today, I want to talk to you about the immigrant threat, the promise and challenge of contemporary migration. Now, this talk is part of the Occupy Volk 2020 series. And my colleagues who have gone before me have done a great job of explaining the motivation and what we hope to accomplish with these talks. So I won't say more in that regard, other than I think the sort of general purpose of it is to make us think about the language we use, the culture, our culture, the historical figures that we revere, as well as giving us important practical advice about what we should and should not do. And so I hope my own talk falls into one of those categories as well. So tonight we're going to talk about immigration. Now, I'm a European historian, so what that means is I'm going to focus primarily on Europe. And the European situation is different in many ways than the US, but nonetheless, I'm going to argue and I'll try to show you ways in which we can see some parallels and some lessons that we ultimately can learn for the US too. But before we get there, a word about language. So immigration today conjures up a range of very strong emotions and reactions in people. That is just as true in the past as well. And so we'll see positive reactions to immigrants. We'll see even more negative ones as well. And one of the ways in which this negative reaction, of course, manifests itself is in the use of xenophobic and racist language and caricatures at times. And you'll see examples of that in this talk. Take that as the warning, as the disclaimer. Now, what I've tried to do is to contextualize this rhetoric and images, and to only use them as necessary, as I felt they were necessary to convey the experience of the migrants themselves. I hope that it goes without saying, ultimately, that these negative stereotypes reflect more the fears and the insecurities of the people who articulated them, rather than the realities of the people that they were meant to describe. So with that, an introduction. Now, immigration is not part and parcel of European memory. In fact, the museums that exist in Europe are dedicated to emigration. Museums like the epic Irish Emigration Museum in Dublin, which apparently just won for the second year in a row Europe's leading tourist attraction, beating out the likes of the Acropolis and the Eiffel Tower. But given the name of the epic Irish Emigration Museum, I mean, what could we expect, right? Maybe the Greeks could go with the awesome Acropolis for next year's event. Let's see if it goes any different for us. But anyway, Western Europeans in general don't consider themselves nations of immigration. They see themselves as having fairly homogeneous populations where everybody is the same and everyone has similar commitments to liberal ideals often. Now, the roots of this comes from the 19th century, when across Europe, we see these larger nation building projects. Now, regardless of the assumptions that these Western European nations have about their people, the reality is for many of them, the 19th century was one in which they became de facto immigrant nations, whether through movement within the state. For instance, the Irish to to England and to the British, to Britain there, but as well. The Italians to France. Now, the Second World War then is going to mark a watershed in the history of migration to Europe. Specifically, the Second World War is a period after which we can see the first large-scale migration of the people from Europeans' colonies back to Europe itself. And ever since their arrival, Europeans have been discussing them, specifically suggesting that these immigrants are people who are ultimately unassimilable, in contrast to people who've come before. And here, I think, which might be surprising to us, the US actually provides a negative example. For instance, in the 1950s, as the first waves of these imperial immigrants arrived in Western Europe, European scholars and politicians pointed to fingers at the United States, where they said African Americans especially, but other more recent immigrants from Africa, Asia, and Latin America were concentrated in inner city ghettos and that were characterized by intergenerational poverty and criminality and widespread rioting. From the 1950s through the 1980s in particular, Europeans feared of being confronted with American situations, as they called them. And the result of this concern was the rise of a number of far-right anti-immigrant parties, like the National Front in Britain and the Front National in France, which is the same translation, but it sounds better to say it that way, I think. Now, one of the characteristics of the late 20th century, and I suppose it's important to emphasize this right off the bat, is that the fears associated with immigration are going to shift over our period of study, just as the immigrant groups are themselves. So what was initially in the initial decades following the Second World War about fears of the creation of an underclass, a caste system that was largely based on the color of a person's skin, is going to shift in the late 20th century to focus on migrants of a particular religious background, that is, Muslim migrants. And in this later 20th century form, the concern was that these Muslim migrants held views that were fundamentally at odds with those of Western liberal European states and liberal democracies in general. This seemed to be only confirmed with events like 9/11, as well as other terrorist attacks that have happened within Europe in the intervening decades. So that's all by way of introduction to trying to tell you what I want to do with our remaining time today. So I actually want to closely examine those stereotypes and assumptions about migrants. And we'll do that by comparing and contrasting the experience of the so-called, what I've called the old migrant groups. We'll look at the Italians in France, the Irish in Britain, and we'll compare that then to the experience of the new migrants that come to Europe post-1945, the West Indian migrants in Britain, and then the Algerians in France. Along the way, we'll look at questions like what drew these people to their destinations, what were their experiences there, and how did the native population respond? And I think the overall question we need to ask ourselves is, are the old immigrants more positively viewed and more easily integrated into those receiving societies than the new migrants? And finally, are there any lessons to learn from this? All right, so first, Ireland. Now, I want to contextualize a little bit of this by saying that there's a long history of people being born in Ireland and traveling to England to perform seasonal labor. And from the 16th century onwards, so there's a long history of this. Now, the Irish are one of those peoples that engage in the mass migrations of the 19th century. In fact, between 1841 and 1861, no fewer than 3 million Irish left Ireland. Now, 2/3 of those people are going to head to the United States, but many will also head to places like Britain, about 500,000 or so. Now, this long history of interaction with one another also means that there's been a long time for the English in particular to develop negative stereotypes about the Irish. And what began as just negative stereotypes in general turned to full-fledged fear and concern in the 1840s, when what was perceived to be waves of invading Irish aliens appeared poised to take control of the country. A little bit of an exaggeration there, but nonetheless. Now, the fears that the English population had in regards to the Irish are reflected in my next few slides. I'm going to briefly mention them for the interest of time. We can talk about them at the end if we have time. But
Sorry.
that's all right. But one of the primary concerns that the English population had was of the Irish as Catholics. So Catholic Ireland was seen as directly oppositional to Anglican Protestant England. And some historians have actually argued that English nationalism is actually built against the Irish Catholic foil. And in my cartoon here, you see this individual this Greek figure on the far right is meant to embody an Irishman. You can see on his sash, it's a little blurry, it says Ultramontane, sort of the idea that sort of the Pope is calling the shots of his Catholic subjects. Another fear and stereotype that the English had of the Irish was that they were parasites. Parasites who in the 19th century came looking for handouts. Many of these Irish immigrants were fairly poor, they were unskilled or semi-skilled, and they filled the slums of large English cities primarily because that's where they could afford to live. And it was the concern that they would draw on what limited poor funds that were available. Now this cartoon right here is just captioned by saying the gleeful Irish peasant carrying his famine relief money while riding on the back of an exhausted English laborer. The Irish were also stereotyped as backward, religiously and socially, but also prone to crime and criminality. Irish were stereotyped as stupid, and the list goes on from there. But another characteristic of the 19th century, a stereotype of the Irish that grows out of other contemporary ideologies, is the racist view. So growing out of sort of 19th century scientific racist views that are, I think, reflected in this cartoon, you see that very clearly the Irishman here on the far left is meant to bear a closer resemblance to this person of African ancestry on the right, both of whom have features that are sort of ape-like, right? And both of whom stand in stark contrast to the Anglo-Teutonic figure in the center. Now, some publications would take this comparison even farther. So, for instance, an article in Punch in 1862 entitled "The Missing Link." I'll let you read through that yourselves and just narrate as we go that the quote essentially suggests that the Irish are the missing link between apes and people of African ancestry, and that anthropologists, rather than going to the wilds of the world to find that missing link, could look a lot closer to home, right? Now, I mentioned, so the English views of the Irish as backwards, as parasites, as criminals. And this last one I think is one that's worth dwelling on just for a moment, because with even today's immigrant populations, there's the general association and stereotype and association with criminality. And that criminality, particularly when it's associated with the second generation of migrants, suggests that the process of integration has failed. And again, is used as evidence that these people will never be assimilable into our society. All right. Well, we have a general sense of some of the beliefs and views that the British had of the Irish. I want to talk a little bit about what was the experience of these migrants. So the traditional story would tell us that the Irish settle in Britain, often in some of these main urban areas, and it's my map here is a little difficult to read, but the larger the dot means the larger the Irish population there. And once they settled, they faced incredible discrimination, but after a few decades, the walls of prejudice fell like the proverbial walls of Jericho, and the Irish were gradually absorbed into the English working class. Remember that story because we'll come back to it. Now, one of the characteristics of the Irish experience in England is the institutional life that develops to support it. So there's a network of Irish pubs, of Irish shops, the Catholic Church, all of whom sort of combine to provide the Irish there with a backbone of their community. And one of the things I think is really interesting when it comes to the Irish and to migrants in general, and I'll return to this a couple times, is the fact that the experience of migration helps people to discover national identities. So it's actually the experience of being outside of Ireland which helps people realize that they're Irish, to imagine that they're Irish. Now, some of this comes from the common experience of just being far from home and gravitating to these similar institutions. But a lot of it comes from the fact that we recognize, as Irish in England do, that we face similar sorts of discrimination from the English populace. That suggests we have something as well. So as a result, it's in England that some historians have suggested that Irish nationalism is actually born, particularly in the area here in Lancashire. So in Lancashire, you have the founding of the Irish Republican Brotherhood in 1858. The Irish Republican Brotherhood, which is sort of the general precursor of the Irish Republican Army. Now, an emphasis of the IRB is to try to resist integration into English society. They believe that all Irish should ultimately return back to Ireland, but it should be an Ireland free from English domination. So the experience of discrimination abroad convinces them that they need to have a free Ireland, and they think that the entire diasporic Irish community, whether we're talking about the one in England, the one in North America, they need to be a part of that. Well, given what we've talked about so far, it's perhaps not surprising then that the Irish are often not well received in Britain. In fact, the slogan, "No Popery," was often enough to mobilize large crowds, because anti-Catholic was in effect also anti-Irish sentiment. And you actually have individuals who make a living out of provoking the anti-Irish sentiment in England. The individual I'll point to here is a lecturer by the name of William Murphy. Now, William Murphy, in his own words, said he wanted to free Great Britain from, quote, "the yoke of the Roman Catholic priesthood and its abettors." And he targeted the Irish communities, particularly in the north of England. And what he did was he made sure that his lectures were widely advertised. He rented as large a hall as he could find. He set his dates, and then he hoped for trouble. In his addresses to his crowd, he would argue for the untenability of the Catholic faith. He made allegations about Catholic atrocities in the past and emphasized the intrigues of the Jesuits in the present. He warned about the Catholic aspiration for world domination that was being manipulated and directed by the Pope. He even would go so far as to say that the priest in particular is who you got to watch out for, because the priest is trying to insinuate himself in the family between the husband and the wife and his children. Now, these religious attacks were addressed in such a furious style and stocked with offensive language that one historian, a guy by the name of Walter Arnstein, has described it as the pornography of the Puritan. And the Irish react just as Murphy himself wanted them to. They shouted at him. They threw stones, both within the venues as well as outside. And in 1871, our story ends in perhaps a way that we might expect it to. In the midst of one of these lectures, a group of Irish miners stormed the stage, grabbed Murphy and drug him off, beat him into unconsciousness. And he would ultimately be saved by the police, and taken home, but he was never the same and died within the year. All right. Well, this is where I need you to remember what we were talking about, of how the Irish eventually, within a decade or so, worked themselves into the English working class. Because a Protestant bystander in the city of Manchester in England in 1910 would comment after observing a St. Patrick's Day parade that, quote, "You'd think we were in bloody Ireland, wouldn't you? Why the hell don't they play something English?" So here we are, nearly 3/4 of a century following the immigration of the Irish to England. And apparently in some of these English towns, it has not led to widespread integration. And in fact, the Irish identity of second and third generation migrants seems to be just as strong, if not stronger. All right, I want to move on and talk about my second group of old migrants, the Italians in France. So the context here is that France in the latter part of the 19th and early part of the 20th century is going to experience a wave of migration, where hundreds of thousands of either unskilled or low-skilled workers will travel to France to find work, often in the public works program, building roads, building bridges, digging tunnels, and mining, and the like. Now, the Italians who go to France are part of the some 14 million Italians who leave the country between 1876 and 1914. And again, as far as the work they do, they worked in the unhealthiest and most dangerous of jobs, ones that the native population is not interested in. As far as the French views of the Italian immigrants, I think the titles for them, for instance, the French called the immigrants the Chinese of Europe, or macaronis, and they were accused of lowering wages and breaking strikes. Union leaders accused the Italians of undermining solidarity, and perhaps, not surprisingly, we see violence break out as well. Now, we might expect in a society where the emphasis is on the negative that immigration does, that the government would step in and pass bills to stop this. But what we see in France in the 1880s and the 1890s is that we see a lot of xenophobic language used and talks about bills being introduced, but ultimately very few of them will actually be passed. And there's a practical reason for that. Because as much as French politicians will play up on xenophobic sentiment, they ultimately realize that immigrants are necessary. Sort of funny development of the French demographic situation in the late 19th and early 20th century is they're not having babies as fast as other parts of Europe. And their economy's expanding. They need people to fill those jobs. They need those migrants, even if they're going to say that they don't. So as a result, we don't see any significant legislation passed. Now, as far as life in Italy, most of the initial Italian migrants are men. Now, that'll begin to change in the 1880s, where more women come over as well. And in general, they live in the southeast, particularly the cities of Marseille and Nice, where by the end of the 19th century, 1 in 5 of the residents there are born in Italy. Now, given the sort of reputation that the Italians had as economic competition, as strike breakers, perhaps it's not surprising that violence breaks out often as well. And this violence had a fairly predictable path. For instance, you would have Italians being accused of lowering wages. Some sort of incident would happen, and then the houses and barracks of Italians would be attacked and pillaged. This violence took a particular French form here as well, what would become known as the chasse d'Italien, the chasing the Italian or hunting down of the Italian. You'd have crowds of French people chasing down Italian migrants, beating them up, occasionally killing them. In fact, we have some 89 such incidents documented between 1867 and 1893. Now, if those perpetrators were put on trial, in general, they were either acquitted or received a very light sentence. And the victims were denied any sort of compensation. Now, the most famous of the anti-Italian actions in France happens in 1893 at the Egamore salt mines. I'll show you where that is. Right there on the coast in that sort of area of Italian settlement. Now, what happened at Egamore was in 1893, a company, the Compagnie des Salines du Midi, a French company that they used evaporation ponds to harvest salt. The owner of this company decided to forego hiring local French labor in favor of hiring Italian immigrants. In August, specifically August 16th and 17th, 1893, the French population responded by targeting those Italian immigrants. They hunted them down, they beat them up, and the result was a number of deaths. Estimates range between 8 to the more extreme number of 150, which is what some Italian newspapers suggested. And the manner of death it's a violent death. There was lynchings, there was beating with clubs, drownings, and rifle shots. And if there weren't deaths, there were many casualties. Well, given that fairly violent reception I just mentioned, it's a wonder that migrants, one, keep coming to France. There must be something drawing them there. And two, it might be even more surprising that by the interwar period, the Italians have moved up in French perception. So a characteristic of the immigration to France after World War I is there going to be a significant influx of immigrants once again. Now, in particular, the Italian population in France is going to double during this period. But rather than signaling a renewed onset of anti-Italian xenophobic reactions, we actually see a more benevolent response. We see a more benevolent response, and perhaps this is partly explainable by the fact that there are other immigrant groups in France. There's quite a few Poles, Spanish, Greeks, Armenians, but especially migrants from Algeria and Morocco, North Africa. So we see the Italians climb up into the ranks of the respectable immigrants, the so-called respectable immigrants. And we have groups like the North Africans taking their place, particularly in the economic sphere, taking on a lot of those poor-paying, dangerous jobs. So the Italians are able to rise up the social ladder. All right, well, what I want to do now is I want to shift from talking about the experience of the old migrants and turn and talk about the new migrants post-1945. Now, the sort of traditional date, which is seen as marking this turning point, is the arrival of a British troop ship, the Empire Windrush, at Tilbury Docks in Essex on June 21st, 1948. Now, what was unique about the Windrush was its passengers. Aboard were some 492 Jamaican men who were returning to Britain. They'd actually worked in Britain during the war in munitions factories, as well as ground crews for the Royal Air Force. They were coming back to England. And the arrival of the Windrush is often seen as the beginning of this large-scale settlement of people of color in what previously had been a nearly entirely white part of the world. But there's even a backstory here that we should consider as well. For instance, during World War I, both the British and the French drew upon the populations of their empires to aid the cause. They often fulfilled roles working in munitions plants. They often did dangerous jobs such as clearing minefields. And often, in the case of Britain, they worked as sailors. Many of these people would though return home after the war. So it's really in World War II where we start to see the seeds for these later mass migrations planted. And again, it happens in largely the same way. You have the British government recruiting heavily in the Caribbean for West Indian migrants to come to Britain to work to fill the hole that's been left in British industry by the mobilization of the British population. Now, many of these West Indian migrants are brought to England and they're kept in isolated barracks. When they're allowed to go out, they quickly encounter the color line. The color line which prevents them from eating in certain restaurants and going to certain dance halls. Now, this is actually, I think, and this is important, it's surprising to the migrants themselves who had a pretty high opinion of Britain. They didn't think that would be part of their experience. And the sort of general reaction that the British public has to the arrival of these non-European migrants in the 1950s and 1960s, we have to say is pretty negative. There's a sense that it'll never be possible to really assimilate these people into British society. Debates were dominated by talk of the color problem, as it was called. And the presence of an increasing number of people of color was viewed as problematic. And again, the concern that there would develop an underclass that was based primarily on skin color. So why were these people so different from the British perspective? Well, one of the most fundamental ways, of course, or at least from the British perspective, was that these West Indian migrants were seen as having a completely different culture, a culture that would only be partially compatible with the British culture. Now, and the assumption was, even if these people managed to assimilate, ultimately their different color skin would mark out their difference for generations to come. That would ultimately, people would be unable to move beyond that. And in that respect, again, they have the US as the negative example in mind. They're concerned that these individuals themselves and their descendants will take up a position in British society, much like African Americans and other recent immigrants from non-European countries. So there's a sense that these migrants are fundamentally different from the British. There's also the economic competition. So like other immigrant groups before them, native white British workers assume that these West Indian migrants are going to take their jobs, be willing to work for less. And there's also romantic competition, potentially. And this is something I haven't talked about yet. One of the characteristics of these first wave of migrants, whether we're talking about the Italians or West Indians, is that they are overwhelmingly male. They're overwhelmingly male. And in the case particularly of Black men, there's the stereotype of the Black man as the predator, right? And the white woman as the victim. And you throw that stereotype in to the larger questions of and fears of racial miscegenation, and it makes for an explosive mix. And another competition was in housing. Of course, tremendously destructive World War II is just over. The Germans have bombed a lot of Britain. Housing has been reduced. And for the working class, in particular in Britain, you have a competition for housing with this West Indian migrant population. Now, historians don't like to say that anything is inevitable, but the result of all this tension is perhaps foreseeable. violence against West Indian migrants is going to result, both in the immediate period following World War I, but also World War II as well. Now, the conflicts in the immediate aftermath of World War I revolve around economics, but they're often articulated in racial terms. So after World War I, we see a slide in a depression in terms of the global shipping industry. Jobs are more difficult to find. In cities like Liverpool, white sailors find themselves in competition for jobs with West Indian migrants. Now, the problem for those white sailors is that they can't kick out these other sailors, primarily because they're British subjects as well. So they're stuck with them, but they ultimately see them as competition. There's also the assumption that when the war is over and the British soldiers who've been fighting at the front return home, that these West Indian migrants will vacate their positions so the heroes can take their spot. Now, when that doesn't happen as quickly as the soldiers and sailors want, it's going to lead to problems. And that violence is going to explode in June of 1919 in Liverpool. So the most exemplary violence is the killing of a young man by the name of Charles Wooten. Charles Wooten was a sailor from Bermuda. He was attacked by a white mob. He was beaten, and he was thrown into a nearby waterway, where he subsequently drowned. Now, in the days following, the Liverpool police would describe what happened next. And if you remember back to what we talked about with the chasse l'Italienne, what happens to people of color in Liverpool over the next few days seems eerily similar. Crowds roaming the street, chasing down any sailor from the West Indies that they can find, physically beating them, or unable to find any, attacking their homes. The police have to intervene. So another instance of this anti-immigrant violence. But what we'll see, again, is going to flare up again post-45. Post-45. Now, this violence is going to take a slightly different form. The group that is sort of pointed to as most responsible for this anti-immigrant violence is one they're known as the Teddy Boys. You see them pictured here. There are working class youth gangs who often would get worked up by far-right politicians in Britain. And they directed their anger at all immigrants. So they had particularly racist nicknames for Cypriots, for West Indians, and for Pakistanis. And I didn't think I needed to include those, but if you're interested, I suppose you can look those up. Now, the most visible manifestation of this racism, of this violence, would happen in Notting Hill, in London, in August of 1958, where the Teddy Boys, playing a leading role, would attack West Indian immigrants, their homes, and their property. And the racist motivation of these rioters was reflected in the slogans that were heard as they attacked these people and their homes. It took the police more than a week to restore order. And importantly, that's the white population targeting the immigrant population, right? All right. Well, the negative images of immigrants of color will persist, but in the 70s and 80s, we'll actually begin to see a shift, where the focus is not so much on the people who immigrated themselves, but their children. So the second generation. And in particular, the second generation of these migrants is perceived as criminals. For instance, in the second half of the 1980s, the criminal behavior among Caribbean men was allegedly 4 times higher than that of Indians and Pakistanis. Now, the result of this was that it turned virtually all people of color into potential criminals in the eyes of the police, as well as the eyes of the British white population. And we see that reflected in the usage of the Vagrancy Act. The Vagrancy Act, which was originally passed in 1824. The Vagrancy Act, which called for arrest if you were deemed to be loitering with intent to commit an arrestable offense. Now, a study published in 1979 suggested that blacks were 15 times more likely to be detained under this act than a white counterpart. Now, in reaction to the discrimination they face, to their status as what they feel to be second-class citizens, we will see these second generation respond with violence. So frustration, discrimination lead to widespread riots in the 1980s. Now, this time, instead of white men attacking migrants, it is the immigrants who are now attacking whites. Now, this was often set off, mostly it was provoked if a second generation or West Indian immigrant was targeted by the police. If the police used force that was deemed excessive, we would often see members of this second generation, along with a few of their white compatriots, join and rise up and target the police. The street fights often ended in widespread pillaging of shops, arson, and hooliganism. Now, the largest outbreak happened in Birmingham in September of 1985, the so-called Hansworth Riots. Now, most observers blame the rioters themselves, and they failed to take into account the structural causes of the violence: unemployment, poverty, and police action. Well, I've mentioned already that we see a shift in views of these immigrants. In the 80s and 90s, we'll see a shift from fears associated with color to fears associated with religion. So Islam had already become the sort of focus of Western fears in the aftermath of the Islamic Revolution in Iran in 1979. And for all the concern that the British population had about West Indian migrants, they were convinced that culturally they were more similar with them than they were with migrants from Asia, particularly people from Pakistan who were Muslim. And this conviction became even more pronounced after events like 9/11. Now, measuring integration, I think, is one of the more difficult things to do. Now, and the scholars have taken a number of approaches to do that. None of them are perfect. But one of the ways that they've done this is they follow the documents. Documents that, like a census, a marriage certificate. And so one of the things that scholars have suggested is that looking at relationships between migrants and the native British population suggests that overall Western Indian migrants are they're more integrating themselves with the white population, and the white population is also more accepting of the immigrants themselves. This is reflected in marriage rates. So for instance, in the 1960s, 80% of the British population viewed interracial relationships as negative. The 1980 census, though, suggested that that view had begun to change. And in fact, more recent numbers suggest that about 40% of men born in the Caribbean marry a white partner. And the number for women born in the Caribbean is lower, with a white partner, it's about 24%. Now, if we compare that to numbers in the US, that suggests that the color line for West Indians is actually much less relevant in Britain than it is in the United States. All right, my last group I want to talk about is the Algerians in France. Now, as far as context, what you should know about Algeria is conquered from the Ottoman Empire by the French in 1830. In 1848, it's made a full-fledged province of France. What that means is Algeria is as French as the Loire province or the Provence province. Now, the treatment of the indigenous Algerian population is it's a colonial relationship. So French settlers pushed native Algerians off their land. There was a separate law code for the Algerian population, and they were made to pay a specific Arab tax. Now, during the war, World War I, the French will draw extensively on Algerian labor to work in factories, to clear minefields, mobilize them to fight as well. So some 25,000 Algerian soldiers will be killed fighting for France in the First World War. Now, after World War II, we see the Algerians recruited to France to work as seasonal laborers. So they would come in, they would work, and then they would go home. Eventually, though, this is going to move to a more permanent settlement. More permanent settlement where Algerians start bringing over their families. Now, as far as the French views of Algerians, there's a stigma associated with them, a stigma that I think ultimately arises from this colonial past. The stigma of Algerians being dirty, stupid, and uncivilized. Algerians are stereotyped as criminal and threat to both women and children. Now, in particular, for French politicians, the Algerian population is portrayed as unassimilable. And if there's a single sort of instant which reflects this threat that the Algerians pose, it's in the headscarf affair in 1989. And from our perspective, it might seem fairly minor. Three girls of North African descent, 2 from Morocco, 1 from Tunisia, are told to remove their headscarf in school, and they refuse. They refuse, they're subsequently expelled, and the school officials justify their action based on the threat to the code of laïcité. Now, laïcité in French is secularism. So the code of secularity. So in France, there's to be a definitive separation between the church and the state, and never should they meet. So the justification of these school officials was that by wearing their headscarves in school, the girls were trying to bring their religion into what was a public sphere. They were effectively trying to convince fellow students to become Muslim. They were proselytizing. Now, eventually, this would lead in 2004 to a law that banned the wearing of all religious symbols in school. So no crosses, no turbans, no headscarves. But it was perceived by the French population as an example of Muslim immigrants fundamentally being incompatible with this idea of separation of church and state. As far as settlement patterns, so like the Irish before them, we see Algerian migrants going where they can afford to live. Many of these migrants initially don't plan on being in France for the long term. So they find the cheapest housing that they can get. And sometimes they can't find regular housing at all. So what would happen is that you get the development of what are known as bidonvilles in French. Now, the bidonvilles, they're appalling. They're essentially shanty towns that we see in present-day cities of developing countries. They lack sanitation, they lack water, and there's more than 119 around Paris of these. And that's on the left, the bidonville. Now, recognition of the problem of the bidonville in 1956 will lead to a program of slum clearance on the part of the French state. And we'll see the construction of a number of these low-rent housing that are large-scale high-rise developments in the suburbs of the large cities of France, places like Marseille, Lyon, and Paris. Now, the word for suburb in French is banlieue, and these constructions become so associated with the suburbs that banlieue now essentially stands for this. So, and today, these banlieues are dominated by these North African migrants. There are places that are characterized by lack of economic opportunity, lack of opportunity in general, criminality, substance abuse, and despair. All right. Well, I want to briefly talk here about identity. So just as we saw with the Irish in England, a characteristic of the Algerian experience in France will be a greater association with an Algerian identity. And one of the groups that's going to be at the forefront of that is this Front de Libération Nationale, or the FLN. The FLN is an Algerian nationalist group that leads the fight against France in the Algerian War of Independence, which happens in the 1950s and the 1960s. Now, like the Irish nationalist groups before them, the FLN opposes integration of Algerians into French society. They want them to stay separate because they ultimately hope that all Algerian migrants will come home. At the same time, second generation North African migrants, particularly from Algeria, will form groups like SOS Racismus, France Plus, and they're meant to fight their position as second-class citizens and encourage the development of a sort of singular identity, an identity that's really drawn from the common discrimination that they face. And so the title that they take upon themselves is that of Boer, which is a complicated sort of reversal of the French word for Arab. Now, we see also during this period large-scale riots initiated by the youth of these Bon Louis against the police, who again they feel are targeting them, treating them as second-class citizens. And the riots also always end up with the pillaging of stores and violence against the police. Well, as far as the reception, you can imagine that, and I think I've outlined so far, that the reception for Algerian migrants is not good. So from the beginning, they're stereotyped as dirty, as uncivilized, and they may have been useful when they were performing the dirty, dangerous work that French workers did not want to perform. But when they stepped out and wished to join French society as a whole, people's reactions became overtly hostile. Now, the Algerian War of Independence plays a key role in this. It leaves really deep scars in both the migrant population in France as well as the French population as well. Now, the most infamous incident of this happened in October of 1961, when Parisian police crushed a peaceful demonstration of tens of thousands of Algerians who were protesting peacefully for the independence of Algeria. Estimates are that approximately 200 Algerians were killed during this time. This sign, I think, is telling many of the Algerians, they're beat up, they're thrown into the Seine, where they subsequently drowned. And that sign right there says, "Here we drown Algerians." Now, again, the legacies of the Algerian War of Independence are evident as well in the formation of some of these far-right populist political groups. In fact, Jean-Marie Le Pen, who founded the Front National in 1983, was himself a former paratrooper in the French military. And he ran the party up until he was kicked out by his daughter in 2015. And it effectively associated immigration with North Africans, with Muslims, and social problems. And they've gotten about 9 to 11% of the vote ever since. All right, wrapping up here. So how are we to evaluate the integration of Algerians into France? Well, one of the most important things to keep in mind is the role of schools. Schools are the one context in France where all children who attend are meant to be treated equally, where children from various backgrounds can be brought together and be taught the French values of liberty, fraternity, and equality. This is where immigrants of the past had assimilated. But while many migrants have a right to an education, they don't have a guarantee of a job after that education. And unemployment rates for Algerians are twice as high as for other migrant groups, say like the Portuguese. In particular, and then again, this reflects the gendered element of migration, Algerian young men have a more difficult time finding jobs than Algerian women. Now, in terms of performance in school, the statistic that's often pointed out is the high dropout rates for Algerian youth. And those rates are high, but if we compare them to native French folks who are of the same class, they're similar. So they're not performing worse than people of their same class. Now, one of the most important sort of reactions, xenophobic reactions, has been from the conviction that ultimately these youth in France pose a threat. They're potential fodder for radicalization. Now, the reality though, and some of the statistics here I'll give you, is that in 1992, 2/3 of Algerians reported as not being religious at all or not practicing. Only 1 in 10 Algerian boys in France reported praying on a regular basis. Another 2 in 10 reported praying occasionally. And so if we do see certain members of this second generation turn to Islamic fundamentalism, I think it reflects less a cultural precondition to do so than more a reaction to the discrimination that they face at the hands of the larger French population. Faced with a lack of opportunities, some will turn to, and it's a very small minority, small minority I should say, turn to more radical solutions. But in the half century that they've been on French soil, Algerians still are perceived as an alien group by the French. Their children still encounter discrimination in the workplace and at school. And yet, with all that, it's remarkable at how the second generation has worked to find their place there. They separate themselves from their parents' culture. They seek in language and in religion to find a place within French society. All right. So, to wrap up. So, guest workers, what we see is that they're initially welcomed by the host society. When the economies are booming, the guest workers are welcome. As soon as we see an economic downtick, we start to see that welcome disappear quickly. Now, the existence of the Irish and the Italians, they tell us that there's no linear path to integration. That while we may assume that European migrants have had an easier path finding acceptance within these host society, the fact is that it often takes several generations. When Europeans today look at more recent migrants and see an unprecedented threat to the state, to their identities, we have to keep in mind that there are similarities with earlier groups. The Irish in Britain is one, I think, where Catholics were viewed as fundamentally different and existing within an international world network bent on domination that in many ways I think is similar to current ideas about Islam and international jihad. All right, so the lessons to learn from this, things that I think are applicable even today in the US. So it's important that people move towards opportunities. In general, unless you're a refugee or a forced migrant, immigrants don't relocate unless there is a demand for their presence. Most of these migrants are either unskilled or semi-skilled, and they fill the positions in society that are unwanted by the host population. Now, the expectations often for the part of these migrants as well as the host societies often are that their stay is going to be temporary. And I think ironically, we start to see that move from temporary to permanence when the host state starts putting greater restrictions on their entry. So they recognize that if we leave, we're never going to get back in. So that actually causes the transition from a temporary to permanent status. And it's at this moment where we have the influx of migrants and their families, when they become more visible, that we, in this receiving society, we're bound to see upticks in xenophobic reactions and negative stereotyping. So paradoxically, though, I think these negative reactions and scapegoating of immigrants time and again have inadvertently served to create the attachments and identity that the host country initially fears that they'll have in the first place. So rather than reflecting reality, negative stereotyping of immigrants works to create that reality. And conversely to the expectations, rather than reflecting a desire to maintain connections with their host country, the experience of discrimination actually leads to people identifying with fellow migrants who've likewise been discriminated against. We saw that with the Irish, we saw that with the Algerians. And finally, there's no single path to integration. It's gendered, it's differentiated, and there's a long way to go, but it's a process that is happening. So that's it.
I think I really like how you kind of gave that overview at the end. And I like, and it sounded like a few other people did too, like the statement that you made that said, rather than reflecting a reality, the stereotypes work to create that reality. Last night I watched Disclosure. I don't know if anyone's seen Disclosure. If not, go on Netflix, watch Disclosure. It's a documentary about trans representation in like movies and TV. And that's exactly what they say in that film, that like the fears that kind of people have, or the way in which there's so much targeting of trans women, right, is because of the media portrayals of trans women having penises, and then men thinking, oh my God, the whole, like cis men thinking, oh my God, the horror, I have to react negatively to this. And so it creates the stereotype of what a trans woman is, and how as a cis man, you're so, like you react to that. And so like the stereotypes have created the reality, not the reality creating the way we actually maybe would react otherwise. And I hadn't really thought about that in terms of the role that the stereotypes with immigration can do the same thing. Go watch that documentary.
I'll ask a question. Since we ended on France, I'm just wondering, I guess, in particular, if you have anything to say, like having this help us put the current beheadings and beheading and then protest in context.
Yeah, so that's a great question. So for those of you who don't know, there was a recent reprinting by Charlie Hebdo, some cartoons that were considered blasphemous of the Prophet Muhammad. And in response to this, a teacher in France who gave a lesson and showed those cartoons was beheaded by a group of young men. So one, I believe, I looked into this a little bit, but all the individuals so far that I've seen arrested they're not French. I think one was from Georgia.
And some Chechens.
Yeah, Chechens and the like. So, and one of the things I think is important to keep in mind is that the actions of individuals shouldn't be used to define the beliefs of the majority. In particular, in 1990, there were 3 million Muslims living in France. I think the number is like closer to 5 million today. And so I think that the protests that are now happening in France on the part of the French Muslim population is they feel that no matter what they do, no matter how they condemn these actions themselves, that they still are associated with them. So I read an article where there was a woman who was saying that she's a devout Muslim, she believes in that separation between church and state, and yet when she goes out on the street, she feels judged, and she said, people spit at me recently, and so there's a feeling that they're still being judged the community as a whole by the actions of just a few.
We were kind of chatting back here about 1919, right? Because that's such a big year in the U.S. For race riots. There's one in Omaha, there's one in Chicago, and I think that parallel is really interesting, just because it wasn't one that I think I realized took place. Like, yeah, yeah, I find that interesting.
I'm curious about the rate of return. So migrant populations and labor.
Mhm.
We think about, oftentimes, at least in US history, you talk about how you have migrant patterns of people going, but most of them return, or Chinese migration, the expectation to go to California and then go back to China and take wealth with them, et cetera. Do you have percentages or broader understanding? I know you talked about a bunch of different things, but that's what I kept thinking about. Did Italians go back to Italy? Did the Irish come down and make money in the rest of Britain and go back? Or
No, so that's a great question. I don't have the numbers specifically, but it's true that the expectation of a lot of these groups is that they're going to go back. That we're just here, we're going to make money, as much money as we possibly can. And we're going to go back and use that, invest that money back in our home communities. What I think is really interesting, particularly with Algeria, is that the Algerian migrants, they come to France and their situations are bad. They face discrimination, and yet they actually are the laws, they're more equal before the law in France than they are in Algeria. So they go to France, they have this different experience. The prospects back home are worse for them in terms of job availability, in terms of land that they can actually purchase. And so that sort of, they inadvertently and unintentionally encourages them to stay. And actually, a French premier in 1973 would talk about empire as being the trap of history for these European countries, that we didn't expect these people that we conquered to come back.
decolonization,
Mhm.
right? The process of decolonization, which
Yeah.
is just wrenching, which they expected when they're colonizing.
Mhm.
Yeah, it's going to come apart someday.
So I know that in this we focus on Britain and France, but when it comes to immigrants coming from countries that are more Islamic in base, like how were they perceived in other European countries? I know, for example, like European nationalism, when I took my class, we read a book talking about what it was like for Islamic immigrants in the Netherlands. So was it like the same within those other countries, or were there some countries that were more accepting of Islamic immigrants? Or if you can answer that, I don't know.
Sure. And you're talking specifically about the book Murder in Amsterdam, right?
Yeah.
It talks about the murder of a Dutch journalist by a second generation Moroccan youth, I believe. And so what the author does, I think, really well in that book is sort of cast in terms of radical enlightenment versus radical Islam, and that confrontation happening in Europe. And so that would be an example I would again argue is, and they talk about the perpetrator there as someone who feels caught between two worlds, right? So he doesn't feel like he fits in the Netherlands. He's found discrimination. He's experienced exclusion, but yet he doesn't feel like he belongs back where his parents are from. And he finds some consolation in a particular form of Islam, and yet at the same time he can't read it in Arabic. He's reading English translations and the like. So someone who's stuck between cultures, who ultimately doesn't feel like they belong anywhere, is then someone who is more likely to be radicalized. Did that answer your question, or?
Kind of.
Okay, so
I mean, not exactly. What I was mainly looking for was, so you talked about like within just France with that like Islamic immigrants, but like compared to like other countries, like are there for example, like I mean, there's some countries in Europe that like could have I don't even know where I'm going with this question anymore. Anyway, You answered it. I'll even know where I'm going.
But so a group I cut was the Turks in Germany, the guest workers. That's another one that it broke my heart to cut them, but that's another example of sort of the population that was expected to leave, actually both the migrants themselves and the German government. So there's not an effort made to integrate them until the Germans, there's the economic downturn, and then they start making it more difficult for people to get in. And then that's when the guest workers decide we want to make our state permanent, and they bring over their families.
It seems to be what's happening with the Syrian refugees
Mhm.
in Europe now. I mean, the Greeks have set aside an entire island to deal with them, and it's basically a massive shanty town as these people are waiting relocation, because Greece is just now out of its own recession and can't support them, but no one else will accept them. So they're just basically on this island, in this massive shanty town, and the Greeks don't want them on the mainland. Because the Greeks still have a visceral reaction to Muslims, thanks to Ottoman rule, and pulling open the Parthenon on the awesome Acropolis.
That is
Catching on, Alex.
there's definitely similar reactions to, like Muslims, like as Dr. Scofield talked about, like Pakistanis and other groups moving to Britain. You have reactions in Germany, in Scandinavia, so very similar reactions in a lot of Western and Northern European countries, and Central European. I mean, that's what's led to a lot of things in Hungary and Poland and stuff like that, which is really ironic because the Polish are then not welcome in Western Europe, but then are like ostracizing anyone who comes there. So
And Poland has a long history with the Crusades, and the Livonian Crusade, the Crusades that were actually on European soil. And so, I mean, the Polish actually make a little bit more sense than some of the other countries in that regard, simply because of their relationship to the papacy.
And so, and I think there is sort of been a xenophobic reaction in Europe with the Syrian refugee crisis. There was also in the 90s with the Bosnian War as well. So coming from the Balkans. So. Mm-hmm.
Regarding the overall goal of immigration and the people who have now immigrated to the new countries being integration, especially in schools, would you say that a lot of the school's goals is like a complete indoctrination of the majority culture, or like more of like a mixture?
So that's interesting. Is the goal of the school indoctrination or mixture? Now, I think, and this sort of gets into sort of France's unique sort of self-conception of itself, because I said that in general, European countries aren't countries of immigration. France would be maybe the exception to that, but it's a French identity that expects people who move to France then do French things. You adopt French values, you adopt French ideology, you accept that separation of church and state. So I think from the state's perspective, that would be something that's expected. You sort of set aside your previous self and you become French and everything that entails. Now, I think in reality that when integration, it never involves a complete loss of previous identity. It's rather a combination of those. And ultimately, when integration happens, it changes both the group that's trying to integrate as well as the society in which they're being integrated. And I think for the better, ultimately.
The Olympics are really interesting to watch in that regard, simply because you've got what are clearly migrants within some of these European delegations, and they're wearing this, garb of the country, but they've always got a necklace or something that is connected to their sort of native culture. And the good example of this that I think of is Giannis Antetokounmpo, the NBA player from Greece, right? From a migrant family, but he always wears that necklace even when he's wearing the Greek flag in various manifestations.
And then I can't remember which half of the survey you were in, but they like Americans and Western Europeans are no better at assimilating than any of the other places are. My favorite example is always the Americans who moved to Texas, right? And like the Mexicans were like, yes, they shall become Mexican, and the Americans are like, I think perhaps not. And so like they were expected to do the same
Yeah.
thing by Mexico and did not, so like,
It's like, then why aren't you learning Spanish?
yeah.
Well,
And you were supposed to become Catholic if you came here. Get rid of those slaves.
All right. Thank you.